So now dealing with a thing that is made from hundreds of parts from every corner of the world, dealing with 30 plus vendors, coordinating the symphony of parts that need to arrive, being put together into a bike. And we're a tiny team. We're not Harley Davidson. So we're still learning from this, and it is incredibly challenging. But at the end of the day, when I see the experience people have when they ride the bike, and this sort of like childlike reaction, like what is this thing, right? I know we've created something unique, and we solved that thing, that product, excellence, however you want to call it. Like, we have it.
Taras, the infamous founder CEO of Tarform, a company that has 20 production, what do you call, they're not e-bikes, they are electric motorcycles, right?
Yes.
I want to get the terminology right.
Yeah, they haven't come up with a new term yet, but electric
Or
motorcycles
maybe
for now.
that's an opportunity. So electric motorbikes on the road, honestly, a sick brand, even sicker product. If you haven't heard of Tarform, go look it up and be amazed. I think we want to just dive
Thanks, man.
right into some of the dynamics, Taras, of like where you're at in your life cycle. And we don't need to go through, the entire origin story of the company, because I think that's been pretty well documented. But there is one thing that I actually just want to kick off this conversation with. Taras, you came to our night school event in New York that we had, and you spoke, and a lot of people enjoyed that conversation, which is online. So anybody listening to this can go to YouTube and look that up. It's great talk about branding. But you mentioned that your bikes are completely plant-based, and you like threw that out there. And I was talking to some folks after the keynote, and they were like, "Oh yeah, he threw out this term plant-based. Like, what does that even mean?" And it was like, "No, like, that's legit. Like, they are through and through, plant-based, and the way that Tarform makes these vehicles is exceptional." So actually, just can you like talk about that for like a second? Because I think that goes over people's heads, and I think that kind of context would be interesting to kick things off with, and then we can talk about business.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely not entirely and through plant-based, because then it would just be a piece of algae floating in the ocean. But what we try to do is to look at what are some of the toxic materials that are being used in the automotive industry, and a lot of it is still petroleum-based plastics, vinyls, so materials that take a very long time for nature to basically restore to its original format. And when we started designing the bike, so kind of a high level, we started a napkin sketch about 6 years ago, spent 2 years building a first prototype that barely works, enough to kind of demonstrate like this is our take on what the future of electric motorcycles should look like. And during that process, also discovered a lot of materials that feel obsolete. And if we're going to be building a product is going to be electric, which is obviously way less emissions, we felt there's a big opportunity to also look at the actual materials that are being used in the manufacturing process. So one big part we identified is, well, let's start replacing the bodywork that is traditionally injection molded plastic, the seats, and said, okay, what other materials can we use? And there was not a lot of alternatives on the market. So we said, well, let's try to develop our own some sort of a plant-based alternative or a composite. So while doing all the structural design and engineering, electrical engineering of the bike, we also focused a lot on the material science. And it took us a while. So eventually we developed a composite. And a composite is basically a process the way carbon fiber panels or bodywork is used on cars and motorcycles. So instead of carbon fiber, which usually comes as a cloth weave, we use flaxseed fiber weave, which is derived from the flax linseed plant. And then we use a bio-based resin, which is essentially kind of like glue that holds it together. And then for color, we use algae carbon. So essentially we take the algae, it's being converted into powder-like substance. We infuse that powder into the bioresin, and then everything sort of comes together as a part. We lift it off the tool, and it becomes a plant-based, a biodegradable part. So the exterior of the bike is made that way. but everything internally, it still uses aluminum. It uses sheet metal, wiring harnesses. So it's far from entirely plant-based. And I don't think it will ever get to being 100% plant-based. But at least sort of the initiative is, how do we begin reducing our carbon footprint throughout the whole
Yeah.
production cycle?
No, it's massively impressive nonetheless. This goes into one of the things I really wanted to chat about as far as your origin story, just to dive into like that pre-seed true 0 to 1 phase. Like you have this concept, there's a lot of gray area. Obviously, you had a commitment to product from day one, and there's a lot of R&D that you had to undergo. How did you approach raising the funds necessary, to actually just commit the time that you needed to commit? I mean, we work with a lot of consumer packaged goods brands, fashion brands, whatever, who are going from 0 to 1, and that takes them a few years and delayed timelines and what have you, just to get through, just to get a beverage to market. Nonetheless, a motorbike. You know what I'm saying? So like, how much did you have to raise? How did you go about doing that? How did you convince investors? What did that look like?
So I spent most of my career in technology, product development, industrial design, furniture, and then on weekends I was building vintage motorcycles. So basically, just finding a 50, 60-year-old piece of two wheels, taking it apart, rebuilding it. So I had pretty good understanding of how do you build a motorcycle, but I had no idea how to build an electric motorcycle because I'm not classically trained electrical engineer. So the idea initially was not just to build an electric prototype, but really to say, okay, the motorcycle is obviously the product, but how do we build a completely new brand? And more importantly, a culture around riding, because there's a lot of stigma around motorcycles, and sort of the entire notion of being a motorcycle rider. People still have this image of what it means to be a motorcycle person. So for us, it was sort of an opportunity, like, okay, we can build a completely new product, but also create a new brand with a different ethos of what it means to ride a motorcycle. So the big vision was already there, and I believe part of it is my ignorance around the complexity of building vehicles. That it was basically like, well, how difficult can it be, right? Like building a machine from scratch made out of hundreds of parts. So I said, this is probably going to take quite a lot of effort and time, but I'm going to focus on the big picture and just start without doing too much initial research on what it requires to build, like what are the components that go into an electric motorcycle. So I spent a little bit of time kind of wrapping my head around the general architecture, and then just started. So I had access to a garage. I had access to a local community of people from mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, started pulling them together and said, hey, this is kind of what we want to do. And then I created a pitch deck, as you would do with most startups, like get the idea out, feel if people are interested in that. And it took me a couple of months to just do the design of the bike in CAD. And I felt good about that. Started showing some of my previous investors from my last company, and they're like, "This is nuts. What are you going to start a motorcycle company? That doesn't make any sense. With what funding? Like you're going to need $100 million in funding to create an automotive company." But I felt that like what do I have to lose? I gotta do this. So I put in the capital I had as my savings, and basically just spent day and night at this garage trying to map out what are the things that needed to build the very first prototype. Like my first goal was, let's show that something exists, something that's real. And as we started doing it, everyone around sort of like, oh, wow, these guys are actually building this thing in a garage in Brooklyn. So some momentum began to form. And then I remember our first investor wrote a check of $50,000. And I'm like, wow, this is all the money we're ever going to need to finish the prototype, which didn't get us very far. But I think one of the key aspects was this pure belief and determination, which I had in the beginning. I never hesitated. I'm like, okay, we're definitely going to be able to build this thing. And by having that conviction, it becomes easier for you to go and tell the story and say, this is what we intend to do. But yet, our very early investors, for them, it was still such a moonshot. They're like, cool, man, here's a check of 20K. Let's maybe it will turn into something. But it was definitely not a safe bet. So our very first investors were usually angel investors who said, "This is a cool project. Like, I want to be part of it." You know, at that point, they didn't really think, "Oh, cool, here's the next Tesla of motorcycles," because we had absolutely nothing to show for them. But then, yeah, we began a very long, very long journey to go from that napkin sketch to having bikes on the road.
Taras, it's interesting because like it seems from what you just described and like fast forwarding to now, there's like two big challenges for this business to like really get it to a place where it can thrive. One was a branding challenge and like connecting with a market that wouldn't necessarily resonate with the vision that you had. And then the other is just a fundraising challenge, right? Which I think you're in the middle of right now. How did those challenges kind of evolve as the business grew? I'd love to hear you talk on that.
The branding challenge was for me kind of the easiest because that's the world I come from, and it was more of like, oh, here's a market that is so outdated, the motorcycle market, right? That if you come in with a new story, a new sense of aesthetics, there is no one to compete with, and the existing motorcycle brands out there, none of them did I find. Oh, here's sort of the next generation of motorcycles. So it gave me kind of a blank slate approach of like, this is what Tarform should look and feel like in terms of aesthetics, in terms of language, brand identity, visuals, all of that. And that was almost the very first thing I did. And then I began designing the actual bike because I knew that the form factor of the bike needed to be something that really stands out, that it doesn't look like an other electric motorcycle or a regular motorcycle for that sake, but yet being relatable, something that has an essence of sort of vintage, but yet modernity to it.
So, of the purchasers who've pre-ordered a bike, how many of them are buying a bike for the first time?
I want to say maybe like 30%.
Yeah, which is it's pretty good, no? That was like the impetus, that was the thesis, like, hey, we'll get people who've never aligned with that Davidson rider, like come and buy a bike for the first time, and then
Yeah,
also attract people who like bikes onto, something that's more beneficial for the environment, more, forward looking, I would say. So it seems
yeah,
like
and
you
that
accomplished that.
but that sort of grew unintentionally because initially, I'm like, well, who's going to buy a motorcycle? It's probably people who already have a motorcycle, or they have a couple of bikes, but they're looking for an electric motorcycle that they haven't seen on the market that fits, their style. But then once we launched the brand and the bike during events, there were so many people coming up and saying, you know what, I never cared about motorcycles, but when I saw this thing, like I want to get into the space. How do I begin riding? Where do I get my license? And then that kind of gave us an insight. Oh wow, there's a whole group of people out there that traditional motorcycle companies aren't speaking to because they're still talking to like your classic, rider. And then we began focusing more on, well, let's allow this experience for anyone,
Yeah.
whether you're interested in bikes or not, whether you're interested in cars or gearhead or not. Like, here's a cleaner way to experience what riding feels like without, all the baggage.
And that's super powerful because I mean, the tripwire for getting people interested in the bike is like the design of it. It's like, how do you, that's the art, right? But it's literally selling the bike to a point where you're kind of opening up a new category. You're able to like expand the market share of like, what a motorcycle rider looks like. Do you think about it in that way?
I do now. I did not a couple of years ago. But sort of looking back and kind of retracing the dots, that's basically what Tesla did, right? So if you look at electric vehicles before the Tesla Roadster, none of them were a desirable product. Like you had the Prius, you had the Volt, you had GM's one or whatever it's called. Like these are not testaments to to iconic design. But then Tesla Roadster came out, and people were like, wow, that's a cool looking car, and it's electric. and it's fast. So that's where I believe design is such a fundamental driving force to adopt new behaviors. And not by saying, oh, here's a more sustainable alternative, but here is an alternative that's better in so many ways, and it happens to be sustainable. But that narrative kind of evolved later. In the beginning, it was just, let's make the most beautiful machine we can and hope that it's better than most regular motorcycles out there.
Let's fast forward to the other side of the equation here. Design, I think, branding challenge, I think we can all agree, like Tarform's growth has been very impressive without a lot of dollars put behind marketing. Now, on the fundraising side of things, I think you are in a very interesting position as a founder because I think, like you said earlier, you've recognized it's going to take a lot more money to lift this thing in the way that you want it to like actually accomplish the vision. And I would say you're pretty good at fundraising. Like, I think you're a pretty inspiring guy in terms of how you pitch and talk. Talk to me about how the market's moved, though. It's obviously super hard to raise in the US right now as a hardware startup. What does that do psychologically for you as a founder?
Yeah, I mean, it's been quite a journey to build a hardware startup, and probably the absolute worst sequence of events. So we started it about 6 years ago, and the first 2 years, like I mentioned, just bootstrapping, trying to get something off the ground. We launched the brand and the two prototypes 2019, and then started getting traction, raised some VC funding, and began like our process from a prototype to manufacturable bike, which is incredibly complicated, more complicated than I would ever imagine it to be. And then COVID. So we're in the middle of building physical things, and I have to send my entire team home because this virus and nobody knows how long it's going to last. So we basically run out of funding, and I have to quarantine with one of our engineers in our shop for 3 months just to finish sort of the product. We launch it after a couple of months, raise additional funding, and then supply chain disruptions. So, if you're in hardware, if you're in automotive, between 2020 to 2022, those were not fun times. It was almost impossible to get parts. If you're looking for manufacturers in Asia, shipping costs were through the roof. Material costs were through the roof. Availability, lead times went from 3 months to a year. So it was probably the absolute worst conditions imaginable to even try to get something that's physical off the ground. But we, kept chirping away and just doing whatever we could, raising basically capital from milestone to milestone to prove to our investors that, look, we're maintaining our momentum as good as we can. We're going from a prototype to a pre-production bike. It works. We validate the technology. We start going through all the regulatory paperwork, like getting this bike actually approved for road legal use in America. And then after that, the big EV wave. So most funding was deployed up until 2022. And we were kind of 2 years behind. So we were still in prototyping phase. But by the time we began delivering our bikes, the EV bubble began to deflate because you had all of these companies that went public, raised billions of dollars, overpromised their projections, and their actual deliveries were way less. And I'm not going to mention names, but there were so many companies that went out of business, and which obviously does not do us any favor because we chose a different approach. We said, let's start small, let's get a few bikes on the road, improve the technology, validate, that there is a market for this, and then once we're mature, then we go and raise a proper funding for us to get into production. And that's kind of the stage we are now. But the market is as tough as it's been, I think, since 2008 in terms of dollars being deployed into hardware. So I think where we are today is probably one of the most difficult phases for a startup to be, which is hardware, electrical vehicles, and a company that has revenue but is not profitable. And it's really hard to be a profitable automotive company when you build one by one vehicles in Brooklyn. So
Yeah, and when you're subscale too, it's, you're in a business where you're just going to need to consistently fundraise until you get to a certain scale. Um, and then I remember us talking, and you were like, there was a couple points where you were really close to getting that like big unlock. I forgot there was a big PE that was, you were close to closing. What was it, like a $15 million a check, something like
Yeah, give or
that,
take.
and yeah, like how many times did you get close to that? And then people were just like last minute, like, nah, sorry.
A couple of times, yeah, and every time it's been the sort of like, and I think this is a story for most startups is, oh, show us more. We're in once you get to the next phase. So we're in once you launch the prototype. We're in once you ship the first product. We're in once you ship the first 50. We're in once you, and so on and so on. So the goalpost sort of moves, which is fine. And where we are now is, so we know how to build this thing. We know people want it. And now we just need to basically start sourcing in volumes so we can start reducing our costs and getting the product on the road. So we kind of widened our approach on who we're looking for in terms of investors, and talking to larger manufacturing groups in Asia and automotive and EV technology who already has manufacturing capabilities, and could both invest into the Tarform, but also allow us to tap into their existing supply chains and basically get into production. So at this moment, it's whatever makes sense for us to get to the next stage.
Yeah, I think it's just a game of like resilience at this point, right? You've been at it at 6 years. It's like you got to keep going. Uh,
Oh yeah, it's 100% mental. Yeah.
yeah. What are the moments for you? Like what, I think this is a personal question, but like I think everyone has the motivating factor for you. Like what's keeping it moving for you?
It's a good question, and something that I asked myself during the absolute, most challenging times is like, what the hell am I doing? This is so much more difficult than I ever imagined. And my previous companies were mainly software based. So now dealing with a thing that is made from hundreds of parts from every corner of the world, dealing with 30 plus vendors and coordinating this symphony of parts that need to arrive, being put together into a bike, quality control, shipping it out, logistics, and after sales, maintenance. And we're a tiny team. Like we're not we're not Harley Davidson. So we're still learning from this, and it is incredibly challenging. But at the end of the day, when I see the experience people have when they ride the bike, and this sort of like childlike, you know, reaction, like what is this thing, right? I know we've created something unique, and we solved that thing, that product, excellence, however we want to call it. Like we have it. Now the challenge is how do we craft a sensible business plan and make this into a financially viable thing. But the big vision is also, there's massive opportunity if you look at sort of the macro scale. Like there are 99% internal combustion motorcycles on the road, less than 1% of them electric. So we're going through the biggest transformation in mobility since 100 years. So the opportunity to be part on the ground level and shape this, to really shape like what does mobility of the future look like? What is the experience we want to provide? What is the sense and the feeling? That is sort of the primary driver. Is imagine being one of the first automotive companies in the 1905, and then fast forward and see, well, how many of them are still around? And I think Tarform has potential.
Yeah, for sure. It's a long journey. You're definitely dedicated to it, but I think from my perspective, like just being on the sidelines for a long time and also being a marketer, the silver lining and kind of the also unfortunate part of all of this is that like the product really markets itself. Like you built such a good product that I have no doubt like if you had the distribution, like people would buy. Kind of validated that with the pre-orders too, right? So now it's just like getting the access, right? Being able to carry it out.
Just the simple mechanics of, you know. No, that's.
You
I
should go
hope
on
so.
Shark Tank and get the distribution money.
Oh man, I think we would get butchered on Shark Tank.
Dude, I wanted to ask you, Since you're talking about product design, do you feel like your product design has sent ripples in the industry? Like, do you think the other big boys are looking at it and saying, wow, okay, maybe we need to up our game here?
So I've definitely seen our design language in other upcoming companies, and they've been inspired by it to say. Initially, I was kind of annoyed. I'm like, "What? Have you seen this part? Like, it's a direct." But then, someone said the biggest compliment you have is when someone copies you. So yeah, sure. What I've also seen, which is good, is that more companies are beginning to embrace more sustainable materials and are developing either biodegradable plastics, plant-based plastics, and on that aspect, go for it. Like the entire industry needs to change. Go and figure it out, which is part of our mission. Like we want to highlight that.
Exactly. Yeah, when you have a mission, you have to be okay with, and you have to want those ripple effects to extend to the entire market, which includes your competition. And so that's just part of it. And that's a really mature approach. I just wanted to ask, one of my biggest questions for you coming on was like around building moats, for your business and your brand and your product. I think Tesla did such a good job of, in having an infrastructural moat, having a technological moat that a lot of their competitors like GM and Ford and whatnot are now adopting, like trying to get vertically integrated within their manufacturing and their systems within their vehicles. And so it's interesting to see, like, I have a Tesla, and now I'm looking again at like what could my next car be, and I want to stick with EVs, but I'm like, what are the trade-offs here, and are there other brands that I might consider? And it's interesting to see that a lot of the moats that Tesla has built up are starting to come down. I think that I just heard that GM is able now to use the Tesla supercharging network. I think they're opening that up. They're adopting a lot of the same manufacturing principles, like I just mentioned, et cetera. And so it's just interesting to see how that is shifting. What is your take? I'd love your take on like the broader EV market, not just motorbikes, but just broadly what you think is happening, but then also how you see that affecting your business and how you're planning for that.
Yeah, good question. It's depends how you look at the whole EV movement. And there's two camps. One of them is they hate it. They're like EVs don't make any sense. You got range anxiety. I'm going to stick with my regular internal combustion car for a while. And the EVs don't really reduce the carbon footprint. Depends how you do the calculations and so on. And then the other camp are like, I'm all in. Once I go electric, I'm never going to go back. And most companies, unfortunately, haven't done a good job educating consumers on the benefits of EVs, and in certain ways exaggerated the sustainability component because they thought that that's going to be the key thing that gets someone to buy an electric vehicle is by shaming them and saying you need to reduce your carbon footprint and an EV is a better alternative. I think people are becoming more aware of that, and the average consumer is educated. They do a lot of research. So I think that story needs to be downplayed, and you simply be transparent and say, at some point, EVs are going to be for sure the most sustainable, but that needs to also happen on the grid. The grid needs to be powered by renewable energy. As long as it's powered by coal, recharging your EV is not going to be the sustainable option. When it comes to maintenance, EVs are way better. But at the end, it's also the experience. So I think finding that balance of what are the selling points and what do you highlight? And from our perspective, it's how do we make something that people actually want to use? And how do you create sort of the overall experience of riding a motorcycle? Can we make it safer? Can we make it more sustainable? Can we use it more user friendly? So we're looking at it more of a holistic approach and not just say, oh, this is the only reason. What I see generally in the EV space is that there's not a lot of initiative happening in terms of charging infrastructure. So especially large American cities like New York, LA, it's still really difficult to find charging stations. For example, in New York, if you ride a motorcycle, you can't really charge it anywhere on the street because you need to go into a parking garage, and most garages don't allow motorcycles. So while in Europe they're doing charging stations and poles pretty much every block, You don't see this in the United States, which prevents widespread adoption of safety is a big concern. More and more in lightweight mobility, we read articles that some electric bicycle caught fire. So there's not enough regulation to make sure that companies are building high quality products. And of course, people are not going to buy a product if they're like, oh my God, is this thing going to catch fire or not? Although that's improving dramatically, and there's, people are being more and more sort of diligent on where they source their components and so on. But if personally, I believe one thing that I'm not fully behind is this movement to build giant electric trucks. Electric trucks that weigh 7,000 pounds in the name of sustainability, and they transport a person that weighs 170 pounds. So the amount of raw materials that you need to extract from Earth to build an electric truck that you're going to drive 3 miles a day, I think it's such a waste of resources, and there are other ways to deploy it. So if a company's intention is to really be sustainable and to try to figure out, how do we reduce our carbon footprint and how do we stop mining precious minerals, the easiest thing you can do is to build lighter and smaller vehicles. And lightweight mobility, especially for cities, makes a ton more sense. So focus on two-wheeled mobility, focus on electric scooters. Obviously we build electric motorcycles, so that's kind of, part of our mission. But I don't see enough of that happening. There's a lot of talk in the four-wheeled mobility, which is cars and automotive. Everyone going electric, but not enough initiative in lightweight mobility.
Can I just ask a question about charging? I as an EV owner, I think a lot about charging infrastructure and like how it could be better. And I had heard that there was like this R&D movement towards what do you call it? Like quick switch in and out battery packs instead of like plug-in charging. You know what I mean? I don't want to go into a rabbit hole here, but for motorbikes, it seems even more doable. Like I could picture on the side of the Manhattan street, like basically a vending machine, if you will, a tube of like batteries that you just, drive up to, switch, put it in and out. Do you think about charging as part of your, I don't know, your product architecture, your catalog, or are you not even focused on that at all? And is that too difficult of an issue? Like just talk about that real quick.
I think it makes sense. It depends on the product category. So for our specific bike, the Luna, the bike that we have now, this is a high performance bike. Does 0 to 60 in about 3.8 seconds, 100-mile range. Battery pack alone in the bike weighs about 150 pounds. So it would be highly impractical to swap a 150-pound piece of equipment. But if you go down in products, for example, electric scooters or electric assist bicycles, then yes, it makes total sense. The batteries are much smaller, they weigh much less. And there are a few companies doing that. One of them is called Gogoro out of Taiwan. So they have a regular, urban scooter. You lift the seat, you pick up a battery, you go to a thing that looks like a vending machine, pop in the battery, put a new one, keep riding. So there are a few companies that fully believe that the future of EV urban mobility is swappable battery packs. I think it's part of the solution, but also I think it's important to look at the actual use case. So the average speed in New York is 3 miles per hour. Average commute is between 7 to 13 miles. So even though range anxiety is the first thing that people think about it, the actual practicality of how people commute in the cities, range anxiety is not really an issue, because you would need to charge, even if you get 50 miles on your scooter, you charge it every 4 days. So I think swappable battery packs is part of the solution, but the biggest solution is just charging infrastructure, making it easier to charge it and plug it in wherever you go.
Last thing I just wanted to mention on this line is I saw a picture of your water jet, your jet ski. Was that like, first of all, it's beautiful. Was that like a concept, brand play, or is that part of the roadmap? And broadly, how do you think about your product roadmap and your catalog extending in the future?
It's definitely part of the roadmap. And the very initial sort of idea was not just to build electric motorcycles, but how do we look at mobility as a lifestyle, and how do we build fun products? So riding a motorcycle is, it's a visceral experience, and so even 6 years ago, the thought was, okay, this is what we're going to start with, electric motorcycles, because it makes sense, and that's also what one of my biggest passions. And then our office is right by the water, so I'm looking over the water. I'm like, oh, interesting. What if we took all the technology we have from the bike and just put it on the water? And in a way, a jet ski, electric jet ski, is kind of a motorcycle on the water. So I spent a couple of months just doing a concept design, and then launched it there, mainly to show here's what we're thinking, and for Tarform not to be perceived as purely as an electric motorcycle company, but to demonstrate this is something we intend to do in the future, and just to gauge the feedback as well and stir up some energy. Why not?
I think just on the roadmap question too, Taras, obviously you guys have a lot of plans. The, water bike and jet ski is part of it. But I think, when we first started talking, I got really excited about the motorbike, like, not like the scooter market, like, because we talked about the TAM, it's massive, like it has crazy applications in like European markets, for instance. I'm curious, like when you think about Tarform's growth, like do you think the Luna is going to be the superstar because of the response that it's had, or have you found yourself like thinking about like the next thing?
So the Luna is our Halo product. Think of it as the Tesla Roadster. So our rollout plan is quite similar. Begin in the premium luxury space, kind of establish the brand, and then our second product is going to be more of a mid-market electric motorcycle. So price that we're looking at around 16,000, which is going to be a much larger demographic and a more affordable product. And then after that, we'll see if we're gonna do a urban scooter, or if we're gonna do an even entry level electric motorcycle. But the roll-up plan is for sure to preserve sort of our quality in the brand, but make our products more accessible.
As this thing has grown, and I remember seeing the first prototype to, obviously you guys are shipping bikes today. It's taken 6 years. Like you're clearly very dedicated to Tarform. Your identity is wrapped up in it too.
Yep.
What do you think what do you think the next 5 years look like for Tarform? Like how are you rationalizing the journey? I'm just curious because I think a lot of founders come to different junctures where they're like, all right, this is taking a lot longer than I thought.
Yes.
How do I rectify that?
I think, yeah, it's a balance between being optimistic and delusional. The closer you get to that, the more you sort of refine the window of what actually makes sense. And me not coming from the world of manufacturing, I lived under the timelines of sort of software iteration, which happens 10 times faster than hardware iterations. So our initial plan was, we were going to start production 2 years ago. And then again, supply chain disruptions, COVID, and just the nature of hardware cycles. Now I have a better understanding of the timelines. So it's going to take a while for us until we are in a full-fledged production mode where we're able to consistently, reliably deliver these bikes at the volumes of hundreds, thousands, and then focus on the next step. So within the next 2 years, although we're very close to getting to a place where we say, okay, cool, now we can go and trigger a production batch of 500 bikes. It's going to take us 12 to 18 months to get to that point. And then we're going to be on a fairly solid footing that we can begin having proper budgets to focus on new product development, setting up our sales and distribution, and then start rolling out the next product, or begin opening up our concept stores, distribution, and sort of going into other markets like Europe and Asia. So within the next 5 years, I see us as being in full, automotive manufacturing scale, having key brand stores all over the world, and having 2 or 3 products out on the road.
How do you carry out your marketing right now? Like, do you have a team? Do you have a person? Can I ask too, like, just to roll this up into one question, do you think, how do you carry out your marketing? How did you carry out the marketing to generate their wait list? And do you think there's anything that you didn't do that you would go back and do to generate more waitlist via marketing?
So because we've been bootstrapped and basically most of the funding has been funneled into product development, which is key. We never really had a marketing budget. So I knew that for every dollar that I'm getting as an investment, 99 cents of it needs to go into the product. So hence our entire team is engineers. And initially I was hoping, well, hopefully the bike speaks for itself. Hopefully the brand has an interesting story that people say, oh, have you seen the company? You should go and check it out. So relying on what every entrepreneur or founder hopes for, the organic growth of your product. Fortunately, we got to that point where with very minimal, I wouldn't say, minimal spend, but there was also a lot of effort to put in to cultivate the brand and get it to a certain point that we feel good about it. And that's also my passion is, how do you create the story around this and focusing on the visuals. So before we were even launched the bike, we did Instagram and started teasing certain parts and components and telling the story behind the build, how the bikes are made. And then after that, it kind of rolled from that, just generating content on Instagram, something that people find interesting. One of the videos went viral and had, 15 million views or something. So that gave us a boost. Tons of features and articles, New York Times. And then we did a photo shoot with Lewis Hamilton, who's, legend in Formula One. So our bike with him on Wall Street Journal. So all of that sort of kind of grew intentionally, organically. And so I guess pretty lucky.
I think it's like a true organic story. Like Taras, I haven't looked at the Instagram, but it's like organically 130,000 followers, something like that. Just people looking at the bike, looking at the content you guys put out and being like, wow, that's cool. Tons of earned media, like you said, Lewis supporting. And then, it really hit me when you see the bike in person, you're just like, that's cool. You kind of want to just follow along for the story. Yeah, I think anyone who's building a product, especially in hardware, but also just even on the consumer side, like you have a textbook case of organic growth that generated what, $2 million in waitlist sales, right? Something like that.
Yeah, it's close to 8. We'll see what the conversion is going to look like, but it's a good spot to be in to be able to demonstrate people want this. And then the investor is like, how much money did you spend on customer acquisition? And I say it, I'm like 0 because it's unbelievable. they expect me to say, oh, we spend about $500 per customer. When I say, well, really nothing.
$0 customer acquisition.
So there's definitely a level of skepticism, like how do you scale that? So at some point we for sure need to have a proper marketing budget to be able to show this is our performance targeted campaigns, and work with you guys to do like a professional acquisition campaign. But so far we've just been, lucky to have wind in our sails to get to this point.
I think, Jackson, that's a great place to cap it off. Taras, thanks so much for joining us again. Excited to see you guys continue to grow.
And your bike is, you get your license.
Believe me, after seeing that thing in New York, that's going to be my first automotive purchase. It's Tarform.
Yes. Nice.
Thank you, man.
All right, guys. Thanks so much.
Cheers.